Bruchim Habaim. On behalf of Ivrit Bamerkaz, Hebrew Center, I want to welcome you to Sicha, a series of online conversations focused on Hebrew. My name is Arnie Winchell, and I am the founding president of Ivrit Bamerkaz. Ivrit Bamerkaz was founded over 10 years ago with the mission to revolutionize the teaching and learning of Hebrew. We chose this focus in service of a vision of a world where Hebrew literacy is vibrant, celebrated, and pivotal to thriving Jewish identity and global Jewish community. When we set out as a small group of Hebrew language educators and enthusiasts to disrupt the status quo, we envisioned our contribution to this chalom, this dream, would come from addressing what has been a lack of success in effectively giving the gift of proficiency in Hebrew to Jews throughout the diaspora. We believe that through a deep investment in our educators and educational system to ensure effective and engaging Hebrew teaching and learning, we will see a Jewish world in which modern Hebrew is not only the language of the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, but also the language of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Our goal in launching Sicha last spring is to engage a wider audience in appreciating the value of investing in Hebrew. Please join us in this effort. We will be holding more Sichot conversations over the next month. This coming Sunday, we are holding one in Hebrew on January 17th at 1 p.m. Now, I want to take the privilege of welcoming and introducing you to our guests, David Koschitzky and Isaac Herzog, who will have a conversation about Hebrew as a connector of the global Jewish community. Isaac Herzog really needs no introduction, but deserves to be recognized for his many leadership roles. He is the chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency of Israel. A Sabra, Isaac was born in Israel in 1960 and is an attorney by profession. Before assuming the role at the Jewish Agency in 2018, Mr. Herzog has been a member of Knesset, or Israel's parliament, in 2003. He had been the chairman of Israel's Labor Party since 2013, as well as the Knesset opposition leader. In the past 15 years, Mr. Herzog has held several ministerial posts: Minister of Housing and Construction, Minister of Tourism, Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Society and Fight Against Anti-Semitism, and Minister of Welfare and Social Services. He also served as government secretary and as government coordinator for the provision of humanitarian aid to Gaza in 2008 through 2009. Before entering politics, Mr. Herzog was a senior partner at the law firm of Herzog, Fox, and Neiman. He lives in Tel Aviv with Michal, and they have 3 sons aged 21 through 33. David Koschitzky, co-chair and CEO North America of IKO, a worldwide manufacturer of roofing and waterproofing materials, 3rd generation. Born in Calgary, Alberta, his family moved to Toronto, where he finished growing up and attended Jewish day school. He has an engineering degree from the University of Toronto and an MBA from the University of Chicago. He and his wife, Serena, spent nearly 15 years living in Chicago, though they intended to be there for a year or 2, where they grew their family, having 5 children, now ranging in age from 27 to 35. They moved back to Toronto in 1995. David was a member of YPO, the global leadership community of extraordinary chief executives, for many years, and has been involved as a lay leader in the Jewish world, having assumed roles in the Chicago Jewish Federation and the UJA Federation of Toronto, including as chair of the board of directors and the campaign chair, and as board president of day schools in both Toronto and Chicago. He was the first chair of CIJA, Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and currently is the immediate past world chair of the Board of Trustees of Keren HaYesod, and a member of the executive of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency. I want to introduce now Rabbi Andrew Ergis, CEO of Hebrew at the Center, who has been moderating this series. For more than 20 years, Rabbi Ergis has held leadership roles across the spectrum of Jewish education, from Jewish camp to day school to JCCs and more. He has demonstrated his own personal passion for Hebrew, not only through his professional life and graduate work in Hebrew language and literature, but also in his personal life as past chair of the board of the Council for Hebrew Language and Culture of America. I want to now turn this over to Andrew and welcome David and Isaac to join us in conversation. Thank you.
Arnie, thank you so much. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you to all of our participants who are joining us in today's exciting Sicha. I do ask that people keep on mute. The arc of this Sicha will begin with some dialogue between Isaac, between David, and then we'll open up the floor to bring everyone else into the conversation. But I'd really love to start with Isaac and David. I'd love to hear your sort of Hebrew journey. What brought you into this space?
Isaac, go first.
No, well, I'm I'm Israeli born. So Hebrew for me is my mother tongue, but you start and I'll fill you in. Because you actually speak incredible Hebrew, David, and there aren't many Jewish leaders of your caliber who speak fluent Hebrew in an amazing way. So where'd you get that Hebrew?
Thank you. I, like many Canadians, I'm the child of survivors. We ended up in Calgary, Alberta, where I was born and raised. But the day school system ended at grade 6. My parents felt important that I should get a day school education. Wanted to move to Toronto, but realized that the Hebrew I learned in Calgary and the Hebrew I might need to know in Toronto were not the same caliber. On top of that, it was 1968 after the 67-day war, and my father was a bit of a Zionist. So we moved to Israel in 68. He enrolled me in public school. We lasted 4 months. He realized he was a Zionist, but not a socialist, and that wasn't going to work for him. We moved back to Toronto, but he continued a custom of sending us during our education years to live with his first cousin who had survived the war with him, a Polish woman who married a Moroccan gentleman who was a teacher of Dikduk, and we would live in their house. And when you're thrown into a house that does not speak English, the woman spoke 4 languages, but English was not one of them. With 5 kids there, you either sank or swam. So I started the Hebrew journey. I'm an unabashed lover of the Hebrew language, and I figured I should learn from my fathers. And so my kids went through the same process. I dumped them on their Israeli cousins, and they too learned the language the same way. It's been a journey I have not regretted one bit. And probably one of the best parts of that journey was my opportunity to have the good fortune and privilege of working with Isaac at the Jewish Agency. Isaac, you see that venture a lot, that story a lot, no?
So first of all, you know, my journey with Hebrew starts with my previous generations. Very few people in our country or in the Jewish world can go back to the books written 4 generations ago by their family. I have the diaries of my grandmother as a child in Hebrew. I have the diaries of Michal's grandparents who made Aliyah to the swamps in 1920 and insisted on speaking only Hebrew. The word of Russian wasn't Erd. I just published the book of my late great-grandfather. It's called O Yashar. It was written 100 years ago. He wrote beautiful Hebrew. And you ask yourself, who would be the clients for the books? But people read Hebrew and incredible Hebrew. And he actually struggled with many words. There's a eulogy here for King George, the fifth, I think. And so you see how he writes it, because he had to adapt English. And of course, my parents' childhood, both in Egypt and in Ireland, was all around Hebrew. So we were brought up to respect the beauty of this language. I'm enamored with Hebrew. I think it's one of the most beautiful languages, elaborate, gorgeous, and I always, when I read the Tanakh, I go into and find these words that are so exciting, and you say to yourself, you know, thousands of years these words are there. So clearly Hebrew is in our hearts.
I'm curious, Isaac, because I know you also have wonderful English skills. I'd be curious really from both of you, what other languages do you speak, and what's it like seeing the world through these different languages? What lenses?
I would say that my parents, when they met, my father came from the war in Europe through Egypt. So my mother's tongue was French, and my father's mother tongue was English. So they spoke a lot of English. My mother spoke with her mother French, and with her sister, Susie Iban, the wife of Abba Ibn, French. So it's like, family language. And so I gathered a lot of languages, and of course Arabic. And English is very easy for me always. I graduated high school in New York. And yet, at the end of it all, I don't think it impacts. We live in a modern world. Everybody's in high tech or on the computer, etc., speak English. But the question is, how many human beings around the world speak Hebrew? Think about it. There are about 10 million, 12 million. That's about it, from 7.5 billion speak Hebrew. Such an important language. And yet there is something out there that blocks people from knowing better Hebrew. And especially Dikduk, which is very complicated. And I think that's the main challenge. I would love for all our people, for all our young people especially, to know Hebrew, and especially engaging Hebrew. With us here today, we have two high officers of the Jewish Agency. One is Pnina Arginau. Pnina, where are you? And so Pnina is the deputy head of strategy of the Jewish Agency, and she's a terrific person. And she's working with us and with Hebrew at the center, and with you, both Andrew and Arnie and the team, on finding a kit of engaging Hebrew to youngsters in summer camps. And Rina Zaslavsky, Rina, raise your hand. So Rina is head of all our Hebrew education on the web in Ulpanim all over the former Soviet Union. So she can broadcast a Hebrew Ulpan 2,000 kilometers to the end of Siberia and teach Hebrew, even if it's 15 people. So there are ways and means to deal with Hebrew, and I think this is our challenge. And I believe that we have to, as we, the Jewish Agency, of course, are very much determined to advance the knowledge of Hebrew.
David, I'm curious from your perspective also, as somebody who's traveled a lot, are there opportunities that you've found when you're in other communities where suddenly Hebrew becomes another way to engage with the local Jewish community?
So I had the privilege.
Oh, both of you.
David, go ahead.
Isaac, you can go first.
No, David, my dear, please.
You want to go first? So when I was chair of Karen Hayesod, I had the opportunity to travel to most of the Jewish communities around the world. And the interesting fact is that many of them don't speak English. I remember in the 70s, I had a good friend that went to South America, and he tells a story. He was in Brazil, he's walking on the street, and he sees somebody, he meets somebody, he looks at them and says, I know this person. There's something common with us. He speaks in English, the guy speaks in nothing. All of a sudden, he said the word gefilte fish, put his hand out and they shook hands. When I went to Brazil, that story wouldn't work for two reasons. First of all, none of the young generation knows what gefilte fish is. And most of that is because most of the Jewish population of Brazil is Sephardic. If it wasn't for Hebrew, I would not have had the opportunity to communicate with the people there. And we need to remember, to the question that Andrew, you brought up before, it used to be that the majority of the Jewish people lived in English-speaking countries. Between the American population, the English population, the Canadian population, that's where the majority of the Jews, especially after the Holocaust, lived. We live in a different time today. The majority of the Jews of the world live in non-English speaking countries. And that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And I believe the only thing that ties us together as a common bond is the Hebrew language.
I would say that sometimes I arrive in a community, and first of all, you know, the Jewish school and everything to do with Hebrew is always extremely, extremely moving and exciting. And then there are the youth movements who operate as if they're in Israel. Most importantly for me is the fact that we have thousands of emissaries, shlichim, all around the country, all around the world, you know, about 2,000 of them, including in summer camps, including in shinshinim, 18-year-old gap year kids who serve in the communities, and they teach Hebrew. And this is sometimes the first exposure of a youngster to a Hebrew-speaking person. So there is a lot, I mean, you feel Hebrew at the center, it's true, because of the synagogue, because of the rabbis, because of the prayers. But the problem is, of course, that it's only those who go to Jewish education. It starts with education. And let's admit, in South Africa, Australia, or Canada, or Latin America, there's a very strong Jewish education because the communities are smaller and much more Jewish education covers Hebrew. North America is a huge challenge. The other day, I read something fascinating about the impact of American Jewry on the beginning stages of the Yishuv, of the Jewish settlement in Palestine. And in the years 1913, 1914, there was what you would call a language war, Milchemet Leshonot, a language war because there was a demand not to teach Hebrew at the Technion. It was a war between German Jews who said no, only German, and American Jews who insisted at the end, after many arguments from within, that it will be in Hebrew. And you say to yourself, okay, that's over 100 years ago. Things have changed dramatically. Hebrew is the central pillar of our nation here. But how do we make an effort to convince American young Jews and Americans in general to know better Hebrew? This is what you're trying to do.
So I'm wondering if, I agree, and I think we can add another layer that there's unfortunately some distancing between a younger generation here in North America and Israel, and we know that Hebrew is a way to connect them. You know, what are they missing out on by not being a part of that community? And where have you seen some successes that's closing that gap?
So first of all, I mean, I think they're missing dramatically on a major part of their Jewish identity. Once you know Hebrew, you're open to a vast array of sources. And I think that's an essential item to deal with Jewish streams, to find ways and means to educate and teach Hebrew. Hebrew is a very complicated language to teach, let's admit. Sometimes I hear new Olim speaking Hebrew, I'm envious. They have the most beautiful Hebrew imaginable. But that's when they are here in Ulpan and all. The question is, how can one sustain the learning of Hebrew and the reading of Hebrew? And I would say that in the internet age, it goes both ways. Israelis can read English and world Jewry can read Hebrew.
Isaac, you said something interesting about David. I want to get David's sense on it. You said something very lovely about David, that he's one of the few lay leaders from the diaspora who you work with, who comes to the table with Hebrew skills. David, I'm kind of wondering if you believe that to be true. And then from your perspective, what do we need to do so that the leadership is prioritizing Hebrew in a way that is different than what we find today?
I would say that my experience has been that when talking about English-speaking countries, where the luxury of English being the language that most people speak, I am one of the few leaders who speak Hebrew. However, when I look at the rest of the diaspora communities, there's a lot of people at the table that come that speak an excellent Hebrew. And I believe it's because for them, Hebrew was a necessity for them to connect, as Isaac said. I would also say, and I would add to Isaac, Isaac said that it's important to have Hebrew for the sources. I think whatever religious movement you belong to, you need Hebrew because anything that's being written, all of the development in the Jewish religion, from a religious perspective, from a philosophical perspective, is really happening in Israel. And if you don't have the Hebrew, you're left out. All you rely on is a translation that can be maybe 5 or 10 years later. But you ask a much more difficult question. Nothing good ever comes easy. I'm a skier. If I want to be a good skier, it doesn't happen because I get on the skis and go down there. Whether you're a tennis player or a basketball player, it takes practice. And the challenge we have is how do we get the young people to take this beautiful thing that we all appreciate and want to master it? And I believe that the best thing that can happen besides day school, and that's a commitment that unfortunately many don't have, is for the young people to come to Israel. If they really come here and start participating, it's amazing how many I've met that say, I want to stay for a longer period of time. And number one on their list, I want to speak Hebrew. I need to understand it.
I want to jump in because I think that one of the things we are facing in the United States in particular, and in England, where I've talked to many educators, is this English-centric, this feeling that you can't learn foreign language or another language. And I think, David, you tap into this idea that it's a challenge, and anything that, you know, really is worth learning, you want to take on the challenge and not be afraid to take it on. But we do have a mentality of, you know, English being the language we speak, and that learning other languages it's really a challenge. And I think one of the things about Hebrew, for those of us who have had the privilege to have that gift, is that the feeling it gives you of being, of really owning something special, that it is a gift, and that idea that you're part of some club, some inside club, I think. And this showed up, I think, also in our conversations about how Hebrew can be a key element in Jewish camp as well, where it becomes the secret language. But it is that language that being part of it, you're inside as opposed to outside. I'm wondering what you, Isaac, how that.
So I went to a high school in New York, and a Jewish school, Ramaz, which is an outstanding school, and people study 12 grades, and they do know their Hebrew, but they don't have it fluent. It's just, I guess it requires being in Israel, as David said. For example, we have Masa program where we bring 15,000 youngsters to Israel for a year. They have to live in Israel. They have to dwell. They have to work in Israel or study or something. So they have to be exposed to Hebrew. And I think that's part of getting them to be acquainted with Hebrew. Then, of course, there is an issue of teachers. There is a lack of teachers who are willing to teach Hebrew. And Sunday schools, let's admit, do not supply enough quantity of Hebrew. Summer camps do. And in summer camps where we at Jewish Agency, we send about 1,400 counselors every year to summer camps. We know how complicated this is in terms of getting in 10 days, 3 weeks, 1 month, 6 weeks to learn Hebrew. So they catch words. That's actually our project, where we are trying to find ways and means to develop linguistics, but minimal linguistics to intrigue the youngsters. Because if we look at it all in all, it's a revival of a nation, clearly. A very incredible revival of a nation. Wealth of writing and usage of Hebrew, which is unprecedented in Jewish history ever. And yet, you have many Jews who can't read the scriptures or the sources because they're too orthodox for them. So it's a difficult Hebrew for them. You have many Jews who can't read the word of Hebrew. So I mean, it's there's kind of a guilt complex about Hebrew in so many quarters. And Israeli leaders love to speak in English. They like to show off that they have good English.
I've never seen that before, but that's an interesting insight you have, Isaac.
Present company excluded.
Of course. You have the Irish
For example,
background.
David, you met some Israeli readers all the time. They speak to you in English, I guess, no?
Agreed.
So I have an interesting question. Really for both of you, because we know that experience in Israel can have profound impact on one's language skills. Shlichim bringing Hebrew, whether it's to a day camp, to a sleepaway camp, the Israeli Americans who are a significant portion of teachers of Hebrew in the day school space. We know that Israel has really revitalized, resecularized this ancient language, but it was a language that used to belong to the entire Jewish people. And I'm wondering if what your thoughts are. Does the global Jewish community still feel like Hebrew belongs to it, or has Hebrew become primarily the treasure of Israelis?
David, go ahead.
Yeah, I always get the tough ones. Listen, I think if you look back in Jewish history, there were many times, look at the time of the Second Commonwealth with the Second Temple, Hebrew was not the #1 language, even in the land of Israel. It was Greek. So while Hebrew has belonged to the Jewish people, there's a lot of times in history where other languages have been substitutes. Our only saving grace is that Hebrew has continued and the other ones have disappeared. I don't think there's a real simple answer to this. I use the example, day school in Toronto. The #1 reason, if you ask parents why they take their children out of day schools, is that it's too difficult for the child to handle the dual curriculum. It's too hard for them to study English and Hebrew. Now, I always smile at that because we have a business in Belgium where the average person learns 4 languages when they first start. But we do have a challenge in the English-speaking countries where English is the do-all and end-all, and the Hebrew language as a treasure isn't valued as much as it should be.
It's true. The Hebrew language is, and you are right in this sense, I must say, David, because I think that setbacks, psychological setbacks, you guys are dealing with Hebrew. And I find all the time that the problem is people are shy to speak Hebrew. They think it's a very difficult language that people will come into them and try to fix it. I mean, there's a lot that we haven't spoken about, the psychological element here.
No, I certainly, as a former head of day school, we very much wanted to introduce Hebrew early on in our 2s and 3s and 4s program, at the same time that we're sort of wrestling with the social emotional growth of young people. And I think when we look at adults, sometimes when you're trying to speak Hebrew and somebody switches to English or immediately corrects you, it's hard to feel motivated to keep on making mistakes. So I think there's a lot of dimensions to this issue. What I'd love to do is let's open up this conversation, which so far has been just fantastic. Thank you both for the great insights. What we'd like to do is invite people to post questions in the chat. And what we'll do is we'll sort of read them out and unmute yourself, and you can ask your question directly, and we'll see how far we can get through our questions. But I see that Joel Hellman has posted a question, who in particular would love to, this seems directed to you, Isaac. Joel, if you want to ask, unmute and ask Isaac about some questions around what the Jewish Agency is prepared to do.
Okay, so you want Joel to ask the question?
Yeah. I'm. If Joel doesn't come on, I can certainly share with you what he said. You know,
He doesn't have a speaker.
Thank you. So Joel writes, what in concrete terms is the Jewish Agency prepared to do in terms of sending many competent and professional trained teachers, people trained in Hebrew as a second language to North America, and not just young shlichim? And, you know, what would that look like over the next 3 to 5 years? And he's also curious how you're dealing with the visa issues that we know are plaguing a lot of folks trying to come to the country.
First of all, the teaching of Hebrew is under the agreements in the organizations that we are linked to under the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, which sends about 400 teachers around North America and the rest of the world, and shlichim who teach Hebrew. We have some projects together with the government of Israel, and I invite also Rina if she wants to add about that, how we teach Hebrew and how the WZO teaches Hebrew. The issue of the visas has been relaxed in many ways, especially with our shlichim. We managed to get the visas done, and I'm sure it'll be done also for the teachers soon. It's been relaxed after a long setback. But Rina, you want to add? Rina Zaslavsky, you want to say anything about?
Yes, I can add a bit that actually it's as Mr. Herzog said, it's WZO, which in charge of teaching Hebrew in all the regions of the world except the former Soviet Union, which is our part. But I know that actually the Jewish Agency is involved with the Ministry of Education with the Chayil project.
Teacher to we have many programs abroad that we're involved in teaching Hebrew.
David,
Andrew,
jump in. Yeah.
Andrew, if I could jump in for 1 minute.
Please.
This probably will be the longest part I'm going to say tonight, but I want to share with you a story that really addresses what the Jewish Agency does in the spirit of Hebrew. My family from my father's side survived the war. From Poland, they were sent to Siberia and then survived in Kazakhstan. In a town called Kserdolo, which is the closest inhabited area to the Russian space program. We went back to see what it was like about 10 years ago. My father and my uncle have an uncle that was buried there. We go to the cemetery. Long story short, like most Jewish community, there's two heads. There's the head of the Jewish community and there's the head of the cemetery. We're there at the cemetery and they tell us this is most of the Jewish population. There wasn't even 1 million there. We had brought kosher food in. We invited them to our hotel to have a meal. The head of the community sits with my uncle and I get the head of the cemetery. Now my uncle speaks Polish, Russian, Yiddish, Hebrew, English. This woman, the head of the community, only speaks Russian, and so they had a conversation. You can imagine the look in my face. What the heck am I going to speak? I only speak English and Hebrew. The head of the cemetery looks at me and says, Ma shlomcha. I have a whole conversation with in Hebrew. And I said, you live in the middle of nowhere. How do you speak Hebrew? And she says, I was blessed with 3 daughters. My first daughter, when she was a young teenager, I sent her to a Jewish Agency day camp in the former Soviet Union, and she learned Hebrew there. And through that camp and her association, they sent her to a program called Na'aleh, which is a high school program in Israel. She went through the program, married a Jewish boy who only speaks Hebrew. My 2 other daughters did the same thing. She said, thanks to the Jewish Agency, not only are my kids married Jewish, but I had to learn Hebrew because I can't speak to my son-in-laws and grandchildren if I don't do that. Those are the programs that in America we don't really appreciate, but those are the programs that the Jewish Agency has been doing for a while throughout the world.
That's very interesting, David, and thank you. I would say that, of course, part of it has to do, I mean, I'm trying to understand, I want to twist a bit the discussion, and I want to ask, Arnie and Andrew and perhaps Rina, do you think it's easier for Russian speakers to learn Hebrew than to American-born to learn Hebrew? Sometimes I tend to think that it's the Cyrillic language that makes Russian Olim speak so beautifully Hebrew, whilst in America it's more difficult. Or am I just saying something that is not relevant?
Actually, actually, if I can answer, maybe try to answer as a Russian speaker here. I believe that you are completely right, because it's a lot of connection. It's a lot of Russian speakers which were part of the revival of the Hebrew. So they brought a lot of Russian into it. And I mean, even sometimes it's a little bit Russian syntax. So it's somehow easier. I have the personal story when I was 17 years old. I'm originally from Armenia, but I was the teacher. It's a long story. I'll make it short. I started to teach Hebrew from the age of 14, because at the same time, everyone who knew something started to teach. It was the underground times. So I went to Moscow. It was the first time that formal delegation of Israelis came for the Moscow Books Fair. And with met us, we had some underground teacher organization, Igud Hamorim, we call it that way, Hamorim, like
donkey.
To make it donkey, like. And we had the first seminar not with ourselves, but with some Israelis. So it was the time I've met Avshalom Kor, of course, every one of you know him. And also part of the delegation, as a part of the delegation, Chaim Guri, Israeli famous poet, came to visit. And I spoke to him, Hebrew, of course. So he said me that he feels that in the air of Moscow, it feels Hebrew. So maybe it's something a bit mystic.
Nina, you want to say something, Nina, from your experience on working on Hebrew?
I can say, we spoke about it a lot with Andrew, and I see that Sharon Avni is here as well, and Jeremy, from the experience of Jewish camps 20 years ago. I think I was a Shlichaim summer camp in Chicago, and part of my work is really to bring Hebrew, but I wasn't really trained to be a Hebrew teacher. It was bringing that through the cultural experience, through what we say in the street, the slang, how you speak in the market, things like that. And the kids loved it. I mean, they were really impressed to that. And we changed, we did motivation on the camps by, instead of saying chadar ochel, just to put the words there instead of saying dining room and things like that. But it was a very small way of, engaging them through the Hebrew. But I felt back then, and also it came back again in my experience as a shlicha in Washington, which was a longer shlichut for 4 years, that the people that we're missing out sometimes, it's actually the professionals, because I came for a summer camp for the kids, but I met a lot of madrichim and a lot of staff that was really meshugaim le'ivri, like they were crazy about Hebrew. They will come and try to speak with me only Hebrew, and they're not fluent, but they're trying. They really want to do that, and we need to be able to provide that, atmosphere or more welcoming sense of how they can engage with Hebrew, without going into a very academic way of learning Hebrew, but just to make them feel comfortable in, just coming to Israel and engage with the local Israelis and speak Hebrew. That's, what the main thing that I went out from my experience, and one of them was in Washington. Actually, we established a small group of people in the JCC that asked me to come and teach them. And I'm not an expert in Hebrew. I'm not a teacher. That's not my expertise. But in the end of the day, we met every week just to talk. And we spoke about, some films that we watch, like Shtizel and Merchak Negia, like some movies, Israeli movies that they watch as a chapter, and then we discuss it in the short conversation in Hebrew. And they loved it. It's brought a lot to the sense of, yes, we can do that. Yes, we can speak. So I agree with you, Yitzhak, that it's hard. Like, it's hard to, and I am as a Nola myself, I can tell that it's really hard. Like, my mother is 35 years already in Israel, and she's still struggling with Hebrew. Hebrew, it's not an easy language. It's really hard for every person that even going through in the span of 2-3 years, it's still a challenge for her. But
Thank you, Panina. Panina, I'm going to actually, in our Jeremy Fingerman had a question in the chat, and let's bring him in as well. Jeremy, what was your question?
Thank you, Andrew and Bougie and David. Wonderful to hear from you. I want to pick up on a little bit on David's story, but also on what Larry wrote in the chat as well. If Hebrew in camp, whether it's day camp or overnight camp, can be an entry point. By the way, I think in David's story, it wound up connecting to Israel. And Bougie, you talk about Masano. Our goal's got to be building a connection to Israel, to global peoplehood through the Hebrew language. My question to you is, how do we better connect, these experiences, whether it's a day camp to an overnight camp to school, and then to the different Israel experiences? Masa, well, hold on, the 8th grade trips, now Israel Now, or the Route 1 that we're reinvigorating, the teen travel to Israel. Those are all, they're deepening the connection. And I think the data from Nefesh B'Nefesh, those that make Aliyah are far more likely to have come out of their camp experience. So I want to just talk about how we make those connections more so, deepen the connections.
Oh, first of all, you have this is an elaborate infrastructure. It's actually a moment to reflect on the huge contribution of Sheldon Adelson to Jewish connectivity and education, because it upgraded the numbers of kids who are participating in so many spheres of life. And yet, the issue, we won't delve into all the problems of American youth, but I think teen travel is the next big thing. We're working on it with a whole group of foundations. I think, but teen travel is of all Israel experiences, immersive experiences, and summer camps. But there's a major debate in Israel going on. Perhaps Israel should invest much more in Jewish schools in America, for example. It never happened. In fact, Jewish schools in America were always an issue because it seems that Americans wanted to stay Americans and not secluded as a subgroup of Jews who go to school, only those who wanted to. But now you have the initiative of the Steinhardts on the parochial, what's it called? Not parochial school, the charter
schools.
You have all sorts of models that are looking to solve it. It's because of the numbers and the costs that still, Jeremy, what you supply is now the core of Jewish identity throughout the 12 grades. And you know how difficult it is in COVID. Yes, we have to include much more of the Hebrew sense. And this is the project we're working on now, to find and develop more systems of bringing Hebrew within the summer camp experience.
So I appreciate that focus, and of course having the CEO of the Foundation for Jewish Camp, Jeremy Fingerman, joining us. So we have a question coming from Eti Dolgan. Eti, yeah. What's your question?
My question is, first of all, I would like to say that I don't think Hebrew is a hard language to learn. I do it here as Hebrew immersion, teaching 100 young children who are American kids mostly, from 9 months old to 6 years old, and they come out speaking the language. I think that that's something maybe that's a myth to say. It's a lot harder to know how to say break in, break out, break off, break, you know, the prepositions in English are a lot harder. So I think if we go with the attitude that Hebrew is not a hard language, it will make it easier for us to find teachers that we can train. And my question is, what has been done here in America in foundations, in centers like Ivrit B'Merkaz and others, and in Israel, in terms of coming up with a system that teaches through Hebrew immersion rather than Hebrew through Siddur? Because I think this is how we're going to be able, because if the kids are learning the Hebrew immersion, to them the Siddur won't be as foreign. And if they read the word Vayomer, but they know to say Ani Omer, they will see that they see Ve'ahavta, and they know to say Ani Ohev. It will be easier to connect between our sources and the spoken language. So, Isaac, I don't know if the Jewish Agency has done anything to promote systems of Hebrew immersions in the United States. And I invite you to come to visit our school as soon as you start traveling.
Cool.
Thank you, Etty.
And I'm
Etty's in
I'm
Chicago.
in Chicago, yeah.
So David or Isaac, do you want to talk about?
I'll start,
Yeah.
and then Isaac will clean up the mess.
You mean
Etty,
concluding remarks?
No, just whatever I make a mess of this answer. But Etty, which school are you at in Chicago?
It's called Moadon Kol Hadash. It's a preschool and an after school, both in Hebrew immersion to American kids, mostly.
So I would say as follows: in the regular day school situation, what you call Hebrew immersion is what in the old days I called Ivrit Be'Ivrit. That has been a battle that has, at least when I was involved with schools in Chicago and in Toronto, has been a battle that's been going on for a while. It's not, unless you're in the very right-wing Orthodox schools, it's not learning Hebrew from the Siddur. There's a number of programs that have been adopted by schools over the years to help with the Hebrew immersion, but it's a very difficult situation. There's fewer and fewer qualified teachers, and it's not enough, and I'm going to be very rude here, it's not enough that I'm an Israeli who lives in America, therefore I can teach Hebrew. Teaching is an art and a skill that just doesn't come because you wake up this morning, you want to do it. And the challenge we have that we are finding, at least in the schools, and I've been involved, I noticed one of the people viewing here was the head of the Board of Jewish Education in Toronto. He can speak better than I can to this issue. Finding qualified teachers who can do Hebrew immersion, regardless of the program, is a much more difficult task.
You're 100% correct.
And by the way, you know, okay, you completed 6, but if they don't have the ability to use their Hebrew, it fades away. That's what you usually have in Jewish schools. It's the Israel experience. It's the connecting to Israel. That's why I think actually modern day technology offers the ability to train your Hebrew on the web or any other way.
We have a question from Rachel Kirschbaum.
Thank you, everybody. It's actually not a question, it's more of a piggyback on what we just heard. I think today there's a big difference between Ivrit Be'Ivrit and immersion. Immersion really does require, as someone mentioned earlier, being in the culture and immersed in the culture, surrounded by the language almost all the time, which is something that in the preschool might be possible, but in a day school dual education program is impossible. You can't even fake the immersion in my experience, and I've been in several day schools. But you can do Ivrit Be'Ivrit, which means that the entire time of instruction is conducted ach v'rak in Hebrew. But going back to what Mr. Herzog, you mentioned about Ramaz and other schools like it, let's say the top schools. I find that their Hebrew education oftentimes focuses on historical documents, literature, history, which is beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily facilitate Hebrew communicative education language. And I think that many schools are learning, I hope, that instead of teaching perhaps first reading, where we focus more on the communicative skills and teach Hebrew more in the model of Ulpan, which focuses on those communicative skills rather than the more academic skills.
It makes a lot of sense, and I think you say something very smart. David, you would agree with me, I'm sure.
As usual, I would. Yes, I think the point about immersion and Ivrit, point well taken. But I truly don't see in the North American day school the ability to do a true Hebrew immersion program. There's just too many reasons that are holding parents back from really letting their kids do that.
So I want to, knowing that Isaac is going to have to leave us fairly soon. First of all, I really appreciate all of the questions and statements. It's always wonderful doing a group like this with other passionate lovers of Hebrew, many of them leaders in the Jewish community. When you ask them to pose a question, they understand the word question to mean to give a short presentation. Perhaps next time we should ask people to give short presentations and we'll get questions. But I'd love to kind of bring this to a conclusion. As you've sort of heard these different ideas and had the opportunity to engage in this conversation, Isaac, David, what are sort of your concluding thoughts? And in particular, what gives you hope for the advancement of Hebrew in the diaspora, and in particular in North America? David, you're on mute.
I simply said Isaac should go first.
So I actually looked for a nice poem that throughout the ages, there were some beautiful poems written about the love of Hebrew. So there's a poem by Rabbi Avraham Yosef Falak. He was from Vilna in the 17th century. He wrote El HaSafa HaIvriya, and he wrote Em HaSafot Imi Habat Ivriya, Netzer Mata'ech Mehar Moriya, Ke'em Gidaltini Belita Makom Tsiya, Vekevnech Huyavti Beshmiya Veriya. And that was in the 17th century. There's a way to teach Hebrew. Even in the Tzia, in the Midbar, in the desert in Lita, that's what he calls Vilna, in the desert. He studied the love of Hebrew. There's a way to teach Hebrew, and we have to find more and more ways and means and tools to teach Hebrew and spread it out. I actually like Jeremy's viewpoint that it has to be all kind of intertwined and connected in all the tools that are there that serve young Jews with their Jewish identity. And so I simply, we're all working on this, and we definitely see you as partners. You know that we are working on a very nice project, but it also happens that we are doing it all over the world. And with this experience, we can definitely improve and develop new techniques.
David, your thoughts.
Listen, for me, just the fact that a group of intelligent people are willing to take an hour from their time or an hour and 15 minutes from their time to talk about the Hebrew language is in itself a very positive sign. And to everybody on this call, thank you. I am extremely optimistic about Hebrew. I think we live in miraculous times that the language is in use. It never ceases to amaze me, the places I go in the world where I hear Hebrew being spoken. So I'm optimistic from that perspective, but I am not unrealistic in realizing that for the North American community specifically, this is a big challenge. And nothing easy is ever solved in 1 hour, but it will take a continual commitment of education in order to keep that dream alive among North Americans.
So David, Isaac, I concur with both of you. David in particular, I don't think it's going to be easy, but having someone like you who has shown others that it is possible is a fundamental component. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, he went up and it says that he saw from the Pisgah, from Dan to Beersheba. I've gone to Petra a few times. When you look westward, you cannot see that far. It must have been, he saw the possibility, and then we were able to make that real. You have demonstrated that through your own life, through the support that you give to Jewish education. And Isaac, we are blessed to have you as a partner, as a leader, as someone who inspires us and who is bringing the best ideas from not only Israel, but from around the world to add to our toolkit as we advance this work. I want to thank you both for being part of this very, very rich Sicha. I want to thank, obviously, Arnie and everyone else at our Hebrew at the Center team. I know Isaac's going to pop off in just a moment as he has another engagement. I do want to share with those of you who've joined us. We have a few more Sichot coming up, but in particular, we have one this coming Sunday, which will be in Hebrew. We'll be with Rabbi Sergio Bergman, the president for Progressive Judaism, Dr. Vardit Ringwald, from the director of the Hebrew program at Middlebury. They'll be talking about lessons from Hebrew language successes in the diaspora beyond North America. And then we'll be gathering on Tuesday, January 26th, with Doctors Netta Aveneri and Dr. David Breithman. That's co-sponsored with the Jewish Education Project, and we'll be looking at reframing Hebrew in the Jewish education space. In early February, we'll close out this section of the Sicha program with a program on translation in literature, television, and film with Stuart Schaffman and Dr. Wendy Zerler. I want to also remind the members of our Sicha advisory who have helped us put this group together that at the conclusion of this call, we'll be hopping into a breakout room. David, thank you so much for being with us. Please thank Serena for allowing us to have some of your time away from your family. And we look forward to seeing everyone in our next Hebrew at the Center program.
Thank you.